The paper shook in Ida Reed's hand, not because of the dry Kansas wind that swept through the doorway of the Keene Ranch house, but because of the fury building behind her eyes. She had read the document 3 times on the ride out from Dodge City, and every time she read it, the words rearranged themselves into something uglier than the last. Foreclosure. Immediate possession. Signed by one Cornelius Keene, acting land agent for the First Territorial Bank of Ford County, dated the 14th of August, 1882. She had not come out here to beg. Ida Reed did not beg. She had buried a husband in the spring mud, raised a son alone through a summer drought, and she was not about to stand on some stranger's porch with her hat in her hands. She had come out here for answers, and she had a question that had been burning in her chest since the moment she peeled that notice off her own front door 3 days ago. The man who opened the door to her knock was not what she expected. She had expected someone with banker's hands and a banker's eyes, cold and flat as a winter creek. Instead, Cornelius Keene filled the doorway the way a cottonwood fills a riverbank, tall and solid and surprising, with sun-dark skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the temples and eyes the deep gray-green of a Kansas sky before a storm. He looked at her. He looked at the paper in her shaking fist. And then he looked back at her, and something moved across his face that she could not immediately name. "Mrs. Reed," he said. "You know my name," she said, and it was not a question, it was an accusation. "I do. Then you know why I am here." He stepped back from the doorway. "Come inside," he said. "I will not come inside. I will stand right here, and you will explain to me how a man can sign his name to a document that strips a widow and her child of the only land they have in the world. And then you will explain to me who told you to do it, because I know for a fact that my late husband did not miss a single mortgage payment in the 12 years he worked that land. I have the receipts. Every last one of them, tied up in a ribbon in a tin box under my bed, and I will drag that tin box into a courtroom if I have to." Cornelius Keene did not flinch. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, very quietly, "Your husband did not miss a payment. The man who did was the man who borrowed against your deed without your knowledge, and the man who arranged the foreclosure is not me." The silence between them stretched out long and taut as fence wire. "Then who?" Ida said. He looked over her shoulder at the empty yard, then back at her. "Come inside," he said again. "There are things you need to know before you walk into town and start waving that paper around. Because the man behind this notice is the kind of man who has already made plans for what happens next, and if you do not know what those plans are, you will walk right into them like a hawk into a trap." She stared at him. She measured him. She was 31 years old, and she had learned in those years to read people with the precision of a surveyor reading land, and what she read in Cornelius Keene's face was not deception. It was something closer to its opposite. It was a man who had a secret he did not want to be carrying. She stepped through the door. That was how it began. 3 months earlier, Ida Reed's life had been exhausting but manageable. She lived on 160 acres of good bottomland 6 miles east of Dodge City, land that her husband Thomas Reed had claimed under the Homestead Act in 1873. Thomas had been a quiet, steady man, a farmer by disposition if not by birth, and he had worked that land with patient, unspectacular diligence for 9 years before a late April fever carried him off in 1882. He left Ida a son named Will, who was 8 years old, a house, a barn, 2 horses, 14 cattle, and a mortgage held by the First Territorial Bank of Ford County with 4 years still to run. He also left her, though she did not know it yet, a debt he had never mentioned. Ida had spent the summer of 1882 running the farm the way Thomas had run it, because she did not know another way. She hired a hand named Rupert Oakes, a quiet, reliable man of 50 who had worked neighboring land before the drought of '79 pushed him off it, and together they managed the cattle and the small corn crop and the kitchen garden with a functionality that was not flourishing but was surviving. Will helped where a boy of 8 could help, and he had his father's quiet steadiness. And sometimes when he stood in the evening light by the barn door, Ida had to look away because the resemblance was a knife. She had been surviving. That was what she told herself in the mornings. Surviving was enough for now. Then she went out to the porch on the 11th of August and found a paper nailed to the door with a single rusted nail. And the paper said that the property at the above-described location was now subject to foreclosure proceedings under the authority of the First Territorial Bank of Ford County, that all occupants were to vacate the premises within 30 days, and that failure to comply would result in legal action under the laws of the state of Kansas. It was signed by Cornelius Keene, land agent. She had stood on that porch for 10 minutes in the morning light, reading it and rereading it, and feeling something cold and final settle into her bones. Then she had gone inside, checked the tin box under her bed, counted every receipt, done the arithmetic 3 times, and confirmed what she already knew. Thomas had never missed a payment. The mortgage was current. There was no legal basis for this action, which meant it was not a legal action. It was something else. She had spent 2 days making arrangements for Will and for the animals, leaving Will in the care of her neighbor Mrs. Garland, who was a practical, kind-hearted woman who asked no questions. She had put on her best dress, which was not very fine, dark gray wool that she had been wearing since the funeral, and she had harnessed the bay horse to the wagon and driven to town to find the First Territorial Bank of Ford County. What she found was a man named Gerald Mast. Gerald Mast was the president of the bank, which was to say he was the man behind the desk in the paneled office at the back, a heavy man in his late 40s with a watch chain that strained across his belly and eyes the color of old dishwater. He had been expecting her. She could see it in the way he did not look surprised when she walked in, and in the way his small smile began before she had even spoken. He told her, in the smooth, regretful language of a man who has delivered this kind of news before, that Thomas Reed had, in the spring of 1881, taken a second loan against the property using the deed as collateral. The amount was $700. The terms were 12 months at 8%. Thomas had signed the papers in this very office on the 3rd of March, 1881. Ida had gripped the arms of the chair and kept her face still. "I need to see those papers," she said. Mast had produced them. Thomas's signature was at the bottom. She had stared at it for a long time. She knew Thomas's handwriting. She had his letters from before they married, 17 of them, which she kept in a separate box. The signature was similar enough to be plausible. It was not so identical as to be obviously forged. "What was the money for?" she said. Mast spread his hands. "I'm afraid I'm not at liberty to say. The loan terms were between Mr. Reed and the bank. He never told me. That was his choice to make, Mrs. Reed. I can tell you that the loan fell into default in March of 1882, 1 month before your husband's death, and that the accumulated interest and penalties have brought the total outstanding amount to $843. $843. She might as well have told her to produce the moon. "I want to speak to the man who processed this loan," she said. "The land agent whose name is on the foreclosure notice." Mast's smile had flickered just slightly. "Mr. Keene handles these matters from his ranch office. He is not employed full-time at the bank. I can give you directions." He gave her directions with rather too much ease, and as she stood and gathered her things and walked out, she felt the distinct sensation of a trap closing at her back. So she drove out to the Keene ranch, and she arrived at 2 o'clock in the afternoon with the foreclosure notice in her fist, and a question she intended to have answered. The question was, who signed Thomas's name? Because Thomas Reed had not borrowed $700 in March of 1881. She was as certain of this as she was certain of anything in her life. She knew exactly what that spring had looked like financially because she had kept the household accounts herself, as she always did, and in March of 1881 the farm had been in good condition, the mortgage was current, and there had been no crisis that would have driven Thomas to borrow that kind of money without telling her. They had told each other everything. That was not sentiment. That was how they had run the farm together, every decision discussed and made together. He would no more have borrowed $700 in secret than he would have sold the land without telling her. Someone had forged his name. And then Thomas had died before anyone could confront him about a loan he never took. And now the bank was using that forged loan as the instrument to take her land. The question was why? What did someone want with 160 acres of bottomland 6 miles east of Dodge City? Inside the ranch house, sitting across a heavy oak table from Cornelius Keene while he poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on the iron stove, she was beginning to understand that the man who had signed the foreclosure notice was not the man who had engineered this scheme. The distinction mattered enormously. "How long have you been the bank's land agent?" she asked. 8 months, he said. He set one of the cups in front of her, and she noticed his hands, which were not banker's hands. They were working hands, scarred at the knuckles, rope-worn on the palms. "I took the position because I needed the income while the ranch was getting established. It is not a position I intend to keep." "But you signed the notice." "I signed the notice," he confirmed. He sat down across from her with his own cup, "and I have been regretting it for 3 days." "Why did you sign it if you knew something was wrong?" He looked at her directly, and she found it uncomfortable to hold that gaze, not because it was threatening, but because it was too honest, the kind of honest that strips away the polite distance you try to maintain between yourself and a stranger. "Because I did not know something was wrong when I signed it. I signed it because Mast put it in front of me with a stack of other documents and told me it was a routine matter, a defaulted loan with no dispute on record. By the time I started asking questions, the notice was already delivered." "What questions did you start asking?" He wrapped both hands around his cup. "The secondary loan paperwork came across my desk for filing last week. I do the filing. There was something about the document that did not sit right with me. The date stamp was inconsistent with the loan ledger entries. The notarization was from a notary who, as far as I can determine, did not practice in Ford County in March of 1881, and the signature on the document did not match the signature on the original mortgage." Ida went very still. "You already knew," she said, "before I came here today. You already knew the loan was fraudulent." "I suspected it strongly," he said. "I did not have proof." "And you went amassed." His jaw tightened. "I tried. He was unavailable. He has been unavailable for 3 days, which is itself suspicious for a man who is normally at his desk before 8 o'clock in the morning." Ida thought about Mast's smooth readiness when she walked into his office, the too easy way he had given her these directions. She thought about what Cornelius had said on the porch. "The man behind this notice has already made plans for what happens next. He sent me here," she said. "He expected me to come here. He wanted me to come here." Cornelius nodded slowly. "And while you are here asking me questions, he is likely doing something with the record of the original mortgage." She was on her feet before he had finished the sentence. "The tin box," she said. "My receipts, every payment receipt for 12 years. Those are proof that the original mortgage was never in default. If he can make those disappear from the bank's ledger, your copies still exist," he said, also standing. "The physical receipts you have are original. He cannot unmake those. But if he alters the ledger, then we need a witness to those receipts today before he can manufacture a counterclaim." He was already moving to the door, reaching for the hat on the hook beside it. "Where are the receipts?" 6 miles east of town at my farm, in a tin box under my bed." "Then we need to go there now, and we need to go by way of the land recorder's office in Dodge City and get a sworn statement in front of the county recorder that those documents exist and are in your possession." He held the door open. "My horse is faster. If I ride ahead and hold the recorder until you arrive by wagon, we will save time." She looked at him. She was standing in a stranger's kitchen, holding a cup of coffee she had not drunk, and this stranger was proposing to ride into town on her behalf to prevent a fraud he was technically, by signature, complicit in. She was not a woman who trusted easily or quickly. Life had not made her one. "Why are you doing this?" she said. He met her eyes. "Because it is right," he said simply, without decoration. And because I put my name on a document I should not have put my name on, and I will not compound that mistake by standing aside while a woman loses her land to a thief." She believed him. She was not entirely comfortable with believing him, because believing people had consequences and she had enough consequences in her life already. But she believed him. "Go," she said. He went. She found out later, filling in the pieces of those afternoon hours from what Cornelius told her, and what the county recorder confirmed, that he rode into Dodge City at a pace that turned heads on Front Street, went directly to the recorder's office, and presented himself to the county recorder, a man named Elias Horn who had known Cornelius for 2 years and trusted him, and told Horn that there was a potential fraud being committed against a landowner in the county, and that he needed Horn to remain in the office until a Mrs. Ida Reed arrived with original documentation. Horn, who was a conscientious public official with a distrust of Gerald Mast that dated back to a boundary dispute in 1879, stayed. Ida arrived 40 minutes later with the tin box. Horn examined every receipt under lamplight while Cornelius and Ida sat on opposite sides of a long wooden table and said very little to each other. When Horn was finished, he looked up over the rims of his spectacles and said that, in his professional opinion, the receipts represented a complete and unbroken record of mortgage payments on the Reed property, and that there was no legal basis for a foreclosure claim based on the original mortgage. "The secondary loan document," he said, turning to Cornelius. "I want to see it." "It is at the bank," Cornelius said. "Then tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock I am going to that bank with the county sheriff, and we are going to examine that document and compare the notarization record against the official notary register for Ford County." He looked at Ida. "Mrs. Reed, you should have legal representation. Do you know James Farwell?" She did not. "He is an attorney on Chestnut Street. He is honest, which in this town is remarkable. Go see him tonight." It was past 5 o'clock when they stepped out of the recorder's office and onto the street. The Kansas sun was still above the horizon, painting the dust in long gold and orange light. Ida stood on the boardwalk and felt something loosen in her chest, not relief exactly, but the first easing of the iron clench that had been there since she found the notice on her door. The tin box was under her arm. The county recorder had made copies of every receipt and filed them officially. She turned to look at Cornelius Keene, who was standing with his hat in his hands, watching the street. "You answered both," she said. He looked at her. "Pardon, the notice," she said, "and my question, who signed Thomas's name, you already knew." He turned his hat in his hands, a slow motion, deliberate. "I had a strong suspicion. Tomorrow morning we will have proof. Why did Mass want my land?" "The railroad," Cornelius said. "The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe is extending a spur line east of Dodge City. Your land sits directly in the path of the most efficient route. An acre of bottomland out there is worth 5 times what it was worth 5 years ago to the right buyer, and the right buyer in this case is a railroad company with deep pockets." Ida absorbed this. "And Mast would collect the land through foreclosure, sell it to the railroad at an enormous profit, and Thomas's signature on a fraudulent loan was the mechanism. That is what I believe. Did he kill Thomas?" The question came out flat and direct, the way she had trained herself to ask difficult things, without the emotional freight that would make a man dodge the answer. Cornelius looked at her carefully. "I do not know," he said. "The fever was real. Other people in the county were sick that spring. But I do not know." She nodded. She filed that information in the place in her mind where she kept things that were not yet answered, and she looked down at the tin box in her hands and she breathed. "I need to find this attorney," she said. "I will walk you there," he said. He walked her to James Farwell's office on Chestnut Street, and Farwell, a lean, dry-voiced man of about 45 with ink-stained fingers and a precise way of listening, agreed to represent her immediately upon hearing the outline of the case. He said the phrase, "fraudulent notarization," 3 times in a voice that suggested he found the prospect genuinely satisfying. Cornelius left her there. He shook Farwell's hand and then turned to Ida and said, "I will be at the bank tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock with Elias Horn and the sheriff. You should be there." "I will be there," she said. He put his hat on, nodded once, and walked out. She watched him through the window as he crossed the street to where his horse was tied. He moved with the unhurried, ground-eating walk of a man used to large spaces, and there was something about him that she kept turning over in her mind, even as Farwell was talking to her about notary registers and fraud statutes, something she could not name and was not sure she wanted to name. She stayed that night at the boarding house on Front Street, run by a woman named Mrs. Clara Poole, who fed her salt pork and cornbread and hot tea and asked no questions, which Ida appreciated enormously. She lay in the narrow bed in the narrow room and listened to the sounds of Dodge City at night, which were considerably more chaotic than the sounds of the farm, and she did not sleep much, and the part of the night she did not spend thinking about Mast and the railroad and Thomas and the fraudulent loan. She spent thinking about Cornelius Keene. This was inconvenient. She told herself it was irrelevant. She told herself she was a widow with a farm and a son and a legal crisis, and she did not have the luxury of whatever it was she was feeling. She told herself that she barely knew the man, had spoken to him for a total of perhaps 2 hours across 2 locations, and that whatever quality he had that made her keep returning to him in her thoughts was a perfectly explicable response to having someone do something decent for her when she had been expecting hostility. She told herself all of this. She did not entirely believe it. Morning came gray and cool, with a smell of rain in the air that the Kansas sky sometimes threatened and rarely delivered. She was dressed and outside before 7, and she went to Farwell's office first, and they walked together to the First Territorial Bank of Ford County, where Elias Horn was already waiting on the boardwalk with Sheriff Ben Calder, a broad, practical-looking man in his early 50s, who had the expression of someone who has seen this kind of thing before and did not particularly enjoy seeing it again. Cornelius arrived 2 minutes later on horseback, dismounted, tied his horse, and came to stand beside her. He looked like he had not slept either, and she found this oddly comforting. "Mast is inside," Horn said. His clerk confirmed it. They went in. What happened in the next 2 hours was simultaneously the most gratifying and the most infuriating experience of Ida's adult life. Gratifying because Gerald Mast, faced with Elias Horn's forensic examination of the notarization on the secondary loan document and Sheriff Calder's quiet, immovable presence, crumbled faster than she had expected. The notary stamp had been used fraudulently. The notary in question, a man named Dillard who had indeed practiced in Ford County, but had retired from the profession in December of 1880, confirmed by telegraph within the hour that he had not notarized any document in March of 1881. The signature comparison, conducted by Horn himself against the original mortgage with its 12 years of Thomas's authenticated signature, was definitive. The signatures did not match. Infuriating because Mast, in the tradition of cornered men, immediately began constructing the story that he himself had been deceived, that a previous employee had handled the transaction, that he had signed the foreclosure notice in good faith, that he was as much a victim of this fraud as anyone. Sheriff Calder arrested him anyway, on charges of fraud and falsification of documents, and Mast was taken out of his own office in handcuffs, his watch chain swinging against his belly, and his face had gone the color of old putty. Ida stood in the middle of the bank's main room, holding her tin box, and watched him go. Farwell was beside her, explaining in his precise way that the foreclosure notice was now legally voided, that the property would remain hers, that the fraudulent secondary loan was null and void, and that she had grounds for a civil suit against the bank for damages. She was listening to him with one part of her attention. The other part was watching Cornelius Keene, who was standing near the door with his arms folded, speaking quietly with Sheriff Calder. He looked, she thought, as though something had been lifted off him, When Calder left and Farwell stepped away to speak with Horn, Cornelius came to stand beside her. "It is done," he said. "For now," she said. "There will be proceedings. Mast will hire a lawyer." "He will, but your position is very strong. Farwell is good." She looked down at the tin box. "The railroad will still want the land. They can want it. They cannot take it by fraud, and they will have to pay fair market value if they want it legitimately, which by my calculation is considerably more than they were expecting to pay when they thought Mast had it handled." She considered this. She considered the farm, and Will, and Rupert Oakes, and the 14 cattle, and the 4 years left on the original mortgage, and the possibility of the railroad paying fair market value for a strip of her land while leaving her enough to keep farming. These were practical thoughts. They were the right thoughts to be having. "Cornelius," she said, and then stopped, because it was the first time she had used his given name and it felt unexpectedly significant. He looked at her, and he had the expression of a man who had also noticed. "Thank you," she said. "That is inadequate for what you did, but I do not have better words right now." "You do not need better words," he said. "Adequacy is undervalued." She looked at him for a moment, and there it was again, the thing she could not name and was not sure she wanted to, except that she was beginning to suspect what it was, and the suspicion was both warming and frightening. "I should get back to the farm," she said. "My son is with a neighbor." "Of course." He paused. "Mrs. Reed." "Yes. If there is anything further you need in terms of the legal process, the bank records, any documentation I can provide, I would like to be of assistance. Formally, I mean, as someone who has knowledge of the bank's internal processes." She regarded him. "Formally, yes." And informally, he looked at her, and something shifted in his face, something careful and honest at the same time. "Informally," he said, "I would like to call on you, with your permission, at some appropriate time." The proposition was as plain and forthright as the man, and it was entirely unexpected, and she was absolutely not ready for it, and yet she said, "At some appropriate time." "Yes, you may." She walked out of the bank and drove home in the wagon with the tin box on the seat beside her, and the Kansas morning had come up gold and wide around her, and she had the strangest sensation of standing at the edge of something. She collected Will from Mrs. Garland's, told him that the trouble with the house had been sorted out, and he looked at her with his father's serious dark eyes and said, "Are we staying?" And she said, "Yes, we are staying." And he nodded as though this was what he had expected, because he had his father's steady conviction that things would work out if you did the right things, and Ida thought this was a dangerous quality in a child and also the most beautiful one. She did not tell him about Cornelius Keene. The trial of Gerald Mast opened in the Ford County Circuit Court in late September of 1882. It was a dry, eventful proceeding that occupied 11 days and produced, in Ida's estimation, considerably more theater than justice, but the outcome was satisfying enough. Mast was convicted of fraud and document falsification. He was sentenced to 3 years in the state penitentiary and ordered to repay all fees and legal costs associated with the voided foreclosure. The fraudulent secondary loan was declared null and void by the court, and the original Reed mortgage was confirmed as valid and current. On the 4th day of the trial, Cornelius Keene took the stand as a witness for the prosecution and testified with the same plain-spoken directness he brought to everything. He described finding the inconsistencies in the loan documentation, his attempts to reach Mast, his decision to assist Ida. The prosecuting attorney, a young man named Dawes who was clearly both impressed and slightly intimidated by Cornelius's manner, kept trying to give him openings to sound heroic, and Cornelius kept declining them, stating only facts in a level voice. Ida sat in the second row of the gallery and watched him. She had been watching him for 11 days in various capacities, at a distance of the courtroom and at closer range when he had come to the farm twice in September to provide additional documentation for Farwell. Both visits had been correct and proper, and also quietly electric, in a way that she was no longer pretending not to notice. He had a habit, she had observed, of listening with his whole body, going still in a way that most people did not, as though he was genuinely interested in what was being said and giving it his full attention. He had a habit of looking at things, the land, the sky, objects in a room, with a kind of calm appreciation. He laughed when he laughed like he meant it, without reservation, and the laugh was rarer than the smile but warmer when it came. He was 34 years old. She knew this because she had asked Elias Horn, who told her without asking why she wanted to know, which she appreciated. He had come to Kansas from Missouri 4 years ago, bought his land with money earned working cattle drives on the Kishom Trail, and had been building the ranch steadily since. He was not wealthy. He was solvent and building. He was not married, had not been married, and Horn did not know why, which meant there was no obvious dark history there, though Ida had learned that obvious dark histories were rarely the most interesting kind. She thought about calling on him, and then decided she was not going to think about that, and thought about it anyway. After the verdict, standing on the courthouse steps in the October chill with Will at her side and Farwell pumping her hand and telling her about the civil suit for damages he intended to file, she looked across the crowd and found Cornelius standing at the edge of it, watching her. He was holding his hat in his hand again, the same unconscious gesture. She caught his eye. He did not smile immediately, which she had come to understand was his way. The smile followed the thought and did not precede it. Then he smiled. She excused herself from Farwell and crossed the distance between her and Cornelius with Will trailing at her side. "Justice," she said. "Justice," he agreed. Will looked up at Cornelius with Thomas's serious dark eyes. Cornelius looked down at him with the attentiveness he brought to everything. "You are Will," Cornelius said. "Yes, sir," said Will. "Your mother tells me you help run the farm." "I do what I can," Will said, with a gravity that was almost comical in an 8-year-old and also entirely genuine. "The cattle are the harder part." "I have 14 cattle of my own," Cornelius said. "I find them somewhat perverse as animals." Will considered this seriously. "Ours are mostly decent," he said, "except the brown one we call Senator. He has a difficult personality." Cornelius's mouth curved. "That is a very precise observation." Will, having decided that this adult was acceptable, went back to looking at the crowd, and Ida looked at Cornelius and found him already looking at her with an expression that was unguarded enough to make her breath catch. "I said I would call on you," he said. "I would still like to." "At some appropriate time," she said. "Would Saturday be appropriate?" "Saturday," she said, "would be appropriate." He came on Saturday, and then the Saturday after that, and then twice in the week between those Saturdays, because there was, legitimately, business to discuss with regard to the civil suit against the bank and the railroad company's formal approach to purchase a strip of her eastern acreage, which Farwell was handling with evident relish. The business was legitimate. The conversation that went beyond the business was also legitimate, in a different way. She learned, across those October afternoons and November evenings when the light came into her kitchen at a low, golden angle, and the smell of coffee was a constant, that Cornelius had grown up in Missouri on a farm that his family had lost during the war. A different kind of loss, but a loss that had the same quality of rupture, of a life simply ceasing and another having to be built from what was left. He had spent his 20s in motion, working cattle, learning the land, and the ranch here was the first place that had felt like somewhere he intended to stay. He had, she discovered, strong opinions about soil composition and weak ones about most political matters, which she found refreshing in inverse measure. He could cook 3 things well and everything else adequately, and he owned more books than she would have expected, a shelf of them along one wall of his ranch house, including a battered copy of Mill's Principles of Political Economy and a complete Shakespeare that had belonged to his mother, and both of these facts delighted her for different reasons. She told him, across those weeks, about Thomas, not the sanitized version she gave to acquaintances, but the actual Thomas, his quiet stubbornness and his particular laugh, and the way he used to read aloud to her in the evenings, and the unbearable specific absence that death left, not the absence of a husband as an abstraction, but of this particular irreplaceable person. Cornelius listened to all of it with the fullness of his attention, and he did not try to fill the silence after with reassurance or sympathy. He simply let the silence exist, and she found this more comforting than anything he could have said. He also told her, one evening in November when the wind was moving cold against the house and Will had gone to bed, about his own grief, which was not the grief of romantic loss, but of a different kind. His younger brother had died on a cattle drive when Cornelius was 22, and the brother was 19, a fast, arbitrary death in a river crossing. He had carried it for 12 years in the particular way that survivors carry things, not loudly but constantly, a weight that became so familiar you stopped noticing it until suddenly you did. "I think you never stop," she said, "carrying it. You just get stronger and it gets relatively lighter." He looked at her across the table. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly it." They were very close to each other. The awareness of this was an almost physical thing, like heat from the stove but not from the stove. She folded her hands around her cup and he looked at them, and then he looked at her and he said, "Ida." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it felt, as the first time had with his, like something had shifted. "Yes," she said, which was not an answer to anything he had asked yet, but they both knew what it meant. He reached across the table and covered her folded hands with one of his, and the gesture was so careful and deliberate that it unmade something in her chest that had been tight for months, and she turned her hand over and held his. They stayed like that for a while, in the warm kitchen with the wind outside and the lamp burning low between them, and it was the simplest and most complicated thing she had experienced since Thomas died. He did not kiss her that evening, because she was learning, a man who did not rush what mattered to him, who moved through important things with the same unhurried deliberateness he brought to reading land or listening to a person speak. He said good night and put his hat on and went out into the cold November dark, and she stood at the window and watched the lamp of his wagon move away down the track until it disappeared. She went to bed and lay in the dark and thought, for the first time since April, about the future as something she might actually want rather than simply endure. The civil suit against the bank was settled in December of 1882. The settlement was not everything Farwell had sought, but it was substantial enough. $600 in damages and the full forgiveness of the remaining 4 years of the original mortgage, so that the Reed land was now owned free and clear by Ida Reed, with no encumbrance whatsoever. The railroad's offer for the eastern strip came in at considerably more than Mast would have paid, because the railroad had not expected to be dealing with a landowner who had legal representation and a recent fraud case on her side, and Ida accepted it on Farwell's advice, netting enough to refurbish the barn, purchase 3 more cattle, and put money in the bank under her own name. She told Will about all of this the day the papers were signed, sitting at the kitchen table with a plate of sugar cookies she had made because it seemed like a day that warranted cookies. Will listened to the financial details with his characteristic gravity, asked 2 very pointed questions about the railroad easement and whether it would affect the grazing land, and then ate a cookie and said, "Good." Then he said, "Is Mr. Keene coming for Christmas?" Ida looked at him. He was looking at the cookies. He was 8 years old and he was, she realized, more observant than she had given him credit for. "I had not thought to ask him," she said. "You should," Will said, still looking at the cookies. "He knows things about cattle." She asked Cornelius the following Saturday, and his expression when she asked had something in it that was too warm and too briefly visible before he composed himself, but she had seen it, and it made her chest do something inconvenient. "I would like that very much," he said. Christmas of 1882 was a quiet, particular kind of celebration. The 3 of them and Rupert Oakes, who had nowhere else to be, and was grateful to be included with the dignity of a man who does not make a show of gratitude. Ida cooked more food than 4 people could reasonably eat, because cooking abundantly, was one of the ways she showed care that did not require her to be articulate about it. There was a goose and sweet potatoes and dried apple pie, and Cornelius brought a bottle of brandy that they passed around after dinner, while Will fell asleep in the armchair by the stove and Rupert told stories about the Texas coast that grew progressively more elaborate as the brandy went around. It was the most comfortable she had felt in a room in as long as she could remember. After Rupert went to his bunk in the barn and Will was carried to bed, Ida and Cornelius sat by the stove in the kitchen in a comfortable quiet that was one of the things she had come to value about being with him, that the silence between them was never something that needed to be filled. "Ida," he said, eventually. "Yes." He had turned his cup in his hands, the habit she recognized. He looked at her with the directness that was one of his most particular qualities. "I am not a man who is given to roundabout approaches when there is a direct one available," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to marry you," he said. "When you are ready. I am not asking you to be ready now. I am asking you to know that this is what I want so that you can think about it without the pressure of a formal moment." She looked at him for a long time. "That is a very unusual way to make a proposal," she said. "I know. It is also a very practical one." "I know that too." She turned her own cup in her hands. "I am not ready now," she said. "I know, but I would like to keep thinking about it." "That is all I am asking," he said. She looked at the lamp between them. She thought about Thomas, the way she always did when anything important happened, the automatic consultation with a person who was no longer there to consult. She thought about what Thomas would have made of Cornelius Keene, and she thought he would have approved, not enthusiastically, because Thomas was not an enthusiastic man, but with the considered, quiet approval he gave to things that had proven their worth. "Ask me again in the spring," she said. He nodded. "In the spring," he said. Winter passed the way Kansas winters passed, with a cold that was serious and a beauty that arrived unexpectedly, the way things do when you are not looking for them. Snow came twice and covered the bottomland in a silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped to think. The cattle were troublesome, as cattle always were in cold, and Senator, the difficult one, required more intervention than all the others combined, and Rupert dealt with this with the patience of a man who has no more surprises left in him. Cornelius came twice a week through January and February, sometimes to help with the work, which he did without making a thing of it, and sometimes just to sit in the kitchen and talk or read. And on 3 occasions he and Will spent an entire afternoon doing something in the barn that they were vague about, and that subsequently produced a repaired wheel on the smaller wagon, which had been wobbling since October. Ida did not ask how this collaboration had occurred. She simply noted it. She was, she realized, in the deep middle of winter, completely and irrevocably in love with Cornelius Keene. This realization arrived not as a dramatic event, but as the recognition of something that had been true for some time, the way you look at a landscape in winter and realize the river has been frozen over so gradually you miss the moment it happened. It was just a fact, cold and clear and obvious. She loved him. This did not frighten her the way she had expected it to. It felt, instead, like something settling into its right place after a long period of being wrong. She told him in February, on a Sunday evening when the snow was coming down outside and Will was asleep and the stove was going and there was no particular reason for it except that it was true and she was tired of carrying it quietly. She said, "I love you. I thought you should know." He looked at her across the table, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, no composure at all, just the thing itself, raw and certain and warm. He said, "I have been in love with you since you stood on my porch and told me you were not there to beg." She laughed, and it surprised her, the laugh, because it came from a place in her chest that she had thought was closed. He smiled at the laugh, the rare and warm one, and then he reached across the table, and this time when he covered her hands with his, she leaned forward and kissed him before she had time to think about it. He kissed her back with a thoroughness that suggested he had been considering it for some time. When they separated, she put her forehead against his, and they sat like that for a moment in the lamplight and the falling snow, and she thought, quietly, that life was a more surprising thing than she generally gave it credit for. March came in that year like a thing with good intentions, cool and clear, with the particular quality of Kansas spring air that smelled of possibility. The grass came back in the bottomland, and the cattle went out to it with the relief of animals who have spent too much time indoors, and even Senator seemed to be in a better humor, or possibly this was projection. On the first Saturday in March, Cornelius arrived in the afternoon and found Ida on the porch, and she looked at him coming across the yard and said, "You said in the spring." He stopped. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "it is spring." He came up onto the porch and stood in front of her. He was, she thought, looking at her with everything he had, nothing held back, no reservation, nothing between them. "Ida Reed," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "I will marry you, Cornelius Keene." He took her hands, and she felt the warmth of his and the steadiness of him, and she thought that this was what she had been building toward since the morning she found the notice on her door. Not the legal resolution, not the financial settlement, not even the freedom of the land, but this specific moment with this specific person who had answered her question and her notice both before the sun went down on that August afternoon, and who had been answering, quietly and consistently, every question she had been afraid to ask since then. They were married in May of 1883 at the Ford County Courthouse, with Elias Horn as witness and James Farwell as the other witness, and Will standing between them with the gravity of a boy who takes the responsibilities of a witness seriously, and Clara Poole from the boarding house who came because she liked Ida and because weddings were one of her great pleasures. It was not a large ceremony. It was not meant to be. It was, like the people getting married, direct and honest, and without unnecessary decoration. The ceremony was conducted by a circuit judge named Peralta, who had a fine natural gravity, and who married people at a rate of perhaps one a month in Ford County. And he had the quality of making even a brief proceeding feel significant, which Ida appreciated. Cornelius put a plain gold ring on her finger, which he had bought from the jeweler on Front Street, and which she had not seen before and which fit, because he had somehow managed, in his quiet, careful way, to determine her ring size without asking her. She looked at this ring after it was on her hand, and then she looked at him, and there was something behind her eyes that she managed to keep there, though barely, because she was not a woman who cried easily, and she was not going to start in the Ford County Courthouse. He saw it anyway. He always saw everything. They went back to the farm because that was where the celebration was. Rupert Oakes had, in a burst of sociability that was somewhat out of character, invited a handful of neighboring farmers and their families, and Mrs. Garland had brought 2 pies and her husband had brought his fiddle, and for 3 hours on a May afternoon the Reed farm, which was shortly to become the Reed Keene farm, had more life in it than it had had since the spring before Thomas died. Will ate an unprecedented amount of pie and then fell asleep under a tree with the boneless abandon of a very tired 8-year-old. And Ida stood near the barn with Cornelius's hand in hers, watching the neighboring families and the late golden light, and thought that grief did not go away. But it made room, eventually, and love came and put itself in the room that was made, and both things were true at the same time, and this was, she supposed, the fullness of a life. They consolidated the 2 operations, Ida's farm and Cornelius's ranch, over the summer of 1883, combining the cattle herds and the staff, bringing Rupert Oakes into a more formal supervisory role that his experience warranted. Cornelius sold his ranch property in the fall, as the farm's bottomland and established buildings were more practical than the ranch for what they were building together, and the money from the sale was put back into improvements, a new roof on the barn, 2 more horses, an expansion of the kitchen garden. Will, who had turned 9 in the spring and was in his 2nd year at the schoolhouse in Dodge City, adapted to the new arrangement with the same unhurried practicality with which he approached everything. He called Cornelius by his given name, which Cornelius had invited, and within 6 months he had begun occasionally calling him something closer to Corny, when he was in a particular mood, which Cornelius bore with considerable dignity and Ida found difficult not to laugh at openly. Their first child together was born in April of 1884. It was a boy, which somehow surprised Ida even though she had prepared for either, arriving in the blue-gray hours before dawn after a night of labor that was long but not dangerous, attended by a midwife named Hannah who had delivered half the children in Ford County and who had a brisk, confident manner that was exactly what you wanted in a labor room. Cornelius had spent the night in the front room with Will, both of them awake for most of it, and when Hannah brought him in to see the child he stood at the edge of the bed and looked at the baby with an expression that Ida had not seen on him before, something so open and undefended that she reached up and touched his face, and he turned into her hand like a man who had not expected to be this undone by anything. "He is all right," she said. "Both of us." "Yes," Cornelius said, and his voice was not quite steady. "Yes, I can see that." They named him Henry, for Cornelius's father, and added Thomas as a middle name, which Cornelius had suggested without prompting, which had made Ida love him additionally, though she had not thought there was room. Henry Thomas Keene was a noisy, vigorous baby who expressed his opinions about everything without reservation, which was different from either of his parents and entertaining as a result. Will regarded his half-brother with the cautious interest of a child who has been an only child for his entire life, and is now confronted with evidence that this is no longer the situation. And then, over the weeks, with the gradual, genuine investment of someone who has decided that this small creature is actually quite interesting. By the time Henry was 3 months old, Will had appointed himself as the person primarily responsible for Henry's entertainment during the daylight hours, a role he performed with characteristic seriousness, and Henry seemed to prefer Will's company to anyone else's, which Will accepted as his due. Life on the farm in the years that followed had the quality of something built carefully and maintained with attention, which was to say it was not without difficulty or loss, because nothing without difficulty or loss was a real life, but the difficulties were met with the combined resources of two people who had each, individually, survived the worst kind of loss and come through it with their ability to love intact, and this was, Ida thought, one of the better forms of resilience. The farm prospered. Not spectacularly, not with the speed of speculation or the luck of a good year's cotton, but with the steady, patient prosperity of land well managed, and people who knew what they were doing. The cattle herd grew to 30 by 1885, and Rupert Oakes, who had been running a tight operation with 2 hired hands, was proud of this in the contained way he was proud of everything, which was to say he mentioned it once and then never again. Cornelius took on a role advising neighboring landowners on their water rights, which had become a significant issue as the population of Ford County grew and the demand on the creek systems increased. He had an aptitude for the kind of technical and legal thinking this required, and he did it without the formal appointment of any position, simply because he was the person people asked, and he generally knew the answer, and this quiet authority was so natural in him that people did not comment on it, they simply relied on it. Ida, for her part, had begun keeping a detailed account book of the farm's operations that went beyond simple household accounting into something closer to a business record, tracking prices and yields and market movements with a precision that eventually came to the attention of Farwell, who was by then handling a number of agricultural land cases, and who began consulting her informally about land values and farm economics. She was not paid for this, because the law of 1883 did not create that kind of arrangement for a woman, but she did it anyway because it interested her, and because it was useful, and she had always been moved more by the fact of usefulness than by its formal recognition. Gerald Mast served 2 of his 3 years in the state penitentiary and was released in the spring of 1885 for reasons that Farwell called the ordinary machinery of leniency applied to men of formerly respectable position, which was his precise way of expressing contempt for a system that treated white-collar fraud as considerably more forgivable than other crimes. He left Ford County immediately upon his release and was not seen or heard of again in that part of Kansas, which was, in Ida's view, the best possible outcome. She thought about him sometimes, not with anything that she would call unresolved feelings, because the resolution had been thorough and legal and final, but with the particular quality of attention she brought to injustice, the way it required you to look at it straight and understand it before you could set it down. What Mast had done was not simply fraud. It was the use of a dead man's name and a widow's vulnerability as instruments of profit, and the willingness to do that said something about the ordinary machinery of power in 1882 Kansas that went beyond one man's greed. It said something about who was expected to have agency and who was expected not to, and about what happened when someone who was expected not to have it showed up with a tin box of receipts and a direct question. She told Cornelius this one evening years later, sitting on the porch of the farm in the early September dark, listening to the crickets and the distant sound of the cattle and the closer sound of Henry, who was now 3 and going through a phase of refusing to sleep before 10 o'clock, protesting at his window. Cornelius listened to all of it, as he listened to everything, completely and without trying to correct or minimize. Then he said, "You answered it yourself. What happens when someone shows up with the evidence and the question?" "I had help," she said. "You had yourself," he said. "The help was secondary." She looked at him. He was looking at the dark beyond the porch, and in the lamplight from the window his profile was the same as it had always been, strong and composed and entirely itself. She reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand over his on the arm of his chair. "Secondary but not insignificant," she said. He turned his hand and held hers. "No," he said, and she could hear the smile in it without seeing it. "Not insignificant." Henry stopped protesting at his window. The crickets continued. The cattle made their low, periodic sounds in the dark. Somewhere beyond the barn an owl spoke once and then fell silent. "Cornelius," she said. "Yes, I am going to have another child." The silence that followed was brief and complete, the kind that happens when something important lands and the world takes a moment to adjust to its weight. Then he turned to look at her, and even in the lamplight she could see the expression that had been on his face the first time at the edge of Henry's bed in the April dawn, but larger now, more practiced, more certain of itself. "When?" he said. "Spring," she said. "Hannah thinks March." He stood up from his chair and crouched down beside hers and put both his hands around her one, and looked at her in the careful, total way he had, and said, "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am telling you in September so you do not spend 6 months managing your expression incorrectly." He laughed, the full warm one, and she felt it in her chest the way she always did, like something unclenching. "A girl this time," she said. "I have a feeling." "Feelings are not reliable forecasters," he said. "Mine are," she said. She was right. March of 1886 brought a daughter with a fine pair of lungs and Ida's eyes and what appeared to be Cornelius's stubbornness in prototype form. They named her Clara for Mrs. Poole at the boarding house, who had given Ida tea and no questions on the night she needed both, and she was healthy and loud, and seemed from her first hours to have a very clear opinion about everything, which Ida regarded as a promising sign. Will, who was 12 by then, and had the self-possession of someone twice his age, examined his new sister with the same careful assessment he brought to everything, and then said she seemed sensible, which was, from Will, high praise. Henry, who was 2, said she was loud, which was accurate. The farm in the spring of 1886 was a place that had become, without announcement or ceremony, exactly what it was meant to be. The bottomland ran green to the eastern edge, where the railroad easement marked the boundary, and the cattle moved through it with the unhurried confidence of animals in good pasture. The barn with its new roof stood solid against the wide Kansas sky. The house, which Cornelius had extended the previous summer with a new room and a proper parlor, had the particular quality of a home that is lived in fully by people who intend to stay. On a morning in May, Ida stood on the porch with Clara against her shoulder and watched Will and Cornelius working the fence line along the north boundary, two figures moving together in the bright morning, Will handing tools and Cornelius working the wire with the steady efficiency of long practice. And the two of them talking, she could see the talk in the movement of their heads, easy and continuous. She thought about the August afternoon 3 years ago when she had driven out to a stranger's ranch with a paper in her fist and a question burning in her chest. And she thought about all the days between then and now. The courthouse and the courtroom and the winter kitchen and the spring proposal and the May wedding and Henry's blue-gray dawn arrival and Clara's March indignation. And all the ordinary days in between that were not dramatic, but were, she understood now, the actual substance of a life. She thought about Thomas, whose land this had been and whose name was on her son's name and who had, in his quiet, steady way, made possible everything that came after by working this ground for 9 years with patient, unspectacular diligence. She held that thought with the same combination of grief and gratitude that she had always held it, the two things not opposed but interwoven, which was the only honest way she knew to carry it. Then Clara made a decisive sound against her shoulder, and Ida shifted her and went inside to see about breakfast. Cornelius came in an hour later with Will behind him, both of them carrying the particular energy of people who have been outside doing something useful. And Cornelius poured himself coffee and sat at the table and watched Ida cooking with an expression he no longer bothered to disguise, which was simply one of open and uncomplicated happiness. Will ate with the focused efficiency of a growing boy and then went out again to check on the cattle with Rupert. Henry appeared from somewhere and climbed onto Cornelius's lap and immediately began telling him something at length about a beetle he had found near the barn. And Cornelius listened to the beetle information with the fullness of his attention, asking questions with apparent genuine interest in the answers. Ida set a plate in front of Cornelius, and he looked up at her over Henry's head, and there was the look that she had been receiving for 3 years now, direct and warm and certain, the look of a man who knows exactly what he has and intends to keep knowing it. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him, and at Henry, who had moved on from beetles to a detailed account of something Senator the difficult cattle had done yesterday that was apparently of great comic significance. She thought about the question she had arrived with that August afternoon, and the answer he had given her before the sun went down, and all the answers since, each one as direct and unhesitating as the first. "No," she said. "Thank you." He raised an eyebrow, the slight one, the way he had. "For answering," she said. Henry looked between them with the faintly suspicious attention of a 3-year-old, who is aware that the adults are doing something over his head, then decided the beetles were more interesting and returned to his account. Outside, the Kansas morning came up full and gold and wide, the way it did at this time of year when the light was young and everything was possible, and the land ran green and honest all the way to the horizon, the land that no one had taken from her, the land she had kept by walking through a stranger's door with her question and her receipts, the land her children would grow up on and know as home. In the parlor, on the shelf beside the window, sat 2 books side by side. One was a battered copy of Mill's Principles of Political Economy that had come from Cornelius's ranch house. The other was a thin volume of poetry by Emily Dickinson that had been Ida's since before her marriage to Thomas, its spine carefully mended with brown paper. They had been placed there sometime in the first year without discussion, and they had sat there since, and they would sit there for a long time to come. Senator the difficult cattle bellowed once from the pasture, with the tone of a creature who has a complaint and intends to register it. Rupert Oak's voice came back across the distance, patient and unhurried, the voice of a man who has long since accepted that some personalities simply require acknowledgement. Will's laugh, young and genuine, carried across the morning air. Clara slept in the cradle in the new room, making the small, precise sounds of an infant who has decided that the world is acceptable on a provisional basis. Henry was now explaining the beetle in considerably more detail than Cornelius had perhaps anticipated. But Cornelius's expression did not waver from its interested attention, because this was how he was. This was the quality of him that she had first seen, and had never stopped finding remarkable: the willingness to be fully present to whatever required his presence, whether it was a fraud case or a fence line or a 3-year-old's beetle taxonomy. She put her hand on his shoulder as she passed behind him to the stove, the brief, natural touch of people who are used to each other, who have moved around each other long enough that the space between them is familiar, and the contact is ordinary in the best sense of that word, something known and easy and right. He covered her hand with his briefly, without looking up, and went back to Henry and the beetle. Ida looked out the kitchen window at the May morning and the green running land, and she breathed. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything. On the 14th of August, 1885, exactly 3 years after she had driven out to the Keene ranch with a foreclosure notice and a question in the August heat, Ida Keene, as she was now, baked a pie, which was not something she did for no reason. Cornelius came in from the field at noon and saw the pie on the table and looked at her with the slight lift of his brow. "Apple," she said. "I can see that. Do you know what day it is?" He thought for a moment, and then the thought arrived, and his face did the thing it sometimes did, opened in a way that made her feel she was seeing something no one else got to see. "August 14th, he said. 3 years, she said. He came across the kitchen and stood in front of her and took her face in both his hands, the working hands, the rope-worn, sun-dark hands, and looked at her with the full and unguarded weight of 3 years of a life built together. "You terrified me," he said, "standing on that porch." "Good," she said. "You were so determined." "I had to be." "You are still," he said. "It is one of my favorite things about you." She put her hands over his on her face. "What is the first favorite thing?" He smiled, the full one, warm and rare and entirely for her. "That," he said, "right there." She kissed him, standing in the kitchen in the noon light with the apple pie cooling on the table, and it had the same quality it always had, thorough and unhurried, the kiss of people who are not afraid that this is temporary. Outside, Henry was chasing something across the yard with the focused energy of a toddler in full pursuit, shouting something that was probably important to him. Will's voice came from the barn, calling to Rupert about something. The cattle moved in the pasture. The land was theirs. The house was full. The question had been answered. All the questions, every one of them, answered in full before the sun went down on that first August afternoon and every afternoon since. This was the life. This was, entirely and without reservation, the life.